Oakley, and Mills Oakley are CARBA's legal partner for assisting members in Australia. We welcome Aegis State members and those persons who are SICA members joining us today. To ask questions, can you please use the chat function at the bottom of the screen? We will accumulate those questions during the course of the presentation, and then Vera will answer them towards the end if she has time. Not, she's kindly said that she'll be able to deal with people individually afterwards. We will be sending out tomorrow a copy of the presentation, so you won't need to do screen captures or anything like that. If you haven't already done so, can you please make sure you join the Australasia ICAEW members LinkedIn group? Future events coming up, we have raising funds in the COVID-19 environment on the 18th of June. And then there are 2 CARBA webinars coming up on the 2nd of July, maximising your productivity, and on the 7th of July, managing remote teams. You should, after this webinar, receive a feedback survey from Helen Wingate in London. Can you please complete this so that we can try and perfect these things as we go forwards. And just a reminder that CARBA may be able to help members with any particular issues they have, whether they're coronavirus related or anything else. So can I now just introduce Vera Visevic. She has over 20 years experience in acting for numerous charities, religious and not-for-profit organisations. So Vera provides a full suite of commercial services to not-for-profit clients. She's a well sought-after speaker throughout Australia with many presentations under her belt. And she's also authored a chapter within Charity Global Guide, published by Thomson Reuters. So without any more, Vera, please.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me this evening, at least it's evening in Sydney, for this hour-long webinar on social enterprises. As Keith has said, you'll be getting a copy of this PowerPoint tomorrow, hopefully, and all my contact details will be there just in case you need to ask me a question which you don't get a chance to ask tonight or we don't actually get an opportunity to respond to. So let's start, because there's a lot there. And we'll now bring up on the screen the PowerPoint. There we go. So over the next hour, we're going to look at social enterprises in Australia. And there's a lot of material here, so we'll see how we go in terms of covering all of the material. But as I've said, you'll get a copy of all of this. So even if I have to skip some slides, you'll be able to see the entire presentation when you get the copy. So let's start. This evening, we'll be looking at 5 different aspects of social enterprises. We'll be studying some current trends. We'll be looking at problems that social enterprises encounter in Australia, spending just a few minutes on what's happening overseas. We'll then launch into the different legal structures that are available to social enterprises. And we're going to finish off with a specific type of social enterprise, which is where you commercialise existing operations. So let's get started. What are some current trends in social enterprises in Australia? Firstly, I think it's worthwhile to start with the definition of a social enterprise. One of the problems is that there's a lot of confusion as to what exactly is a social enterprise, and this is one of the issues faced by people wanting to establish one. So there's no statutory definition. I have found a definition which I think encapsulates the different elements of a social enterprise, and it's up there on the screen. So this is my favourite definition. And here are the 4 elements of a social enterprise. 1, it is a structure which is driven by a mission that has a public or community benefit. 2, it uses trade to fulfil that mission. Thirdly, it obtains most of its income from that trade. And fourthly, it applies most of the profits towards that mission. A social enterprise can be a for-profit structure, a not-for-profit structure, or a hybrid. And I'm going to go through examples of each of these later on, so you'll see what I mean, and you'll see the flexibility that's available if you, or say a client of yours, wishes to establish a social enterprise. In terms of the landscape in Australia, in the last few years, it has been a time of growth with regard to establishing social enterprises. And I have found that both government, both state and federal, and also businesses are looking at trying to achieve social outcomes through their purchasing. So we have very few statistics, but the statistics I have found show that over 40% of social enterprises in Australia have been operating for at least 10 years, and 34% of social enterprises have been established in the last 2 to 5 years. And I think that the more recent social enterprises which have been established are a result of state governments being very strategic about social enterprises and actually setting up departments or setting aside money to assist people who wish to establish one. I'm going to focus on a couple of states in Australia to give you some examples of what's been happening. So let's start with Victoria. In February, about 3 years ago, the Victorian government launched its social enterprise strategy and ended up injecting about $5 million into this sector. As a consequence, there are now approximately 3,500 social enterprises in Victoria, which is a fairly decent number. And the average revenue per social enterprise is about 1.6 million. At the moment, there are approximately 60,000 individual Victorians employed by social enterprise, which is fairly significant. Let's go to my home state, New South Wales. In 2015, the New South Wales government established I guess you call it a department. It's the Office of Social Impact Investment. And this particular office aims to deliver at least 2 investments to market each year and has already made 6 investments valued at over $200 million to date. If you or a client or some organisation you're involved with is actually interested in this, then it's just a matter of finding the website and making a request for a proposal. Generally across Australia since 2015, social impact investments have now been established in about 4 states, and the Commonwealth Government has also committed funding towards social impact investment. In 2018, the New South Wales Government announced it would contribute $20 million to a social impact investment targeting homelessness. So you can see that it is something that's on the radar. More and more state governments are aware of it. More and more state governments are actually putting aside money to, I guess, encourage businesses, not-for-profits, individuals to establish a social enterprise. So if it is something that you or an organisation you know is interested in, it is worth having a look because there's some money sitting there that you may be able to access to help you get started. In terms of general trends in social enterprises, I found this quote, which I think is quite relevant, especially even just in the last couple of weeks. It says that the public expectations of your company, this is a business, so your company being a for-profit business, have never been greater. To prosper over time, every company must not only deliver financial performance, but also show how it makes a positive contribution to society. Society is demanding that companies serve a social purpose. And I think we saw this quite easily in the last couple of weeks, even with the Black Lives Matter campaign, where I've even noticed in Australia, various businesses are promoting their position on that particular issue. And I'm seeing that that's becoming much more common, be it the bushfires or any other sort of social issue. For-profit businesses are becoming much more vocal about it. So in light of that, there seems to be a greater expectation for businesses to think beyond their bottom line and to start thinking about how they can actually contribute to the common good. And some of these businesses are doing that through a social enterprise. I want to stop here and actually give you an example which has always encouraged me, and it's a classical example of a social enterprise in Australia. And the statistics from this example actually show, if you do it well, how successful it can be. So the example here is Street, which is a social enterprise established in Victoria. And Street was an existing charity, a public benevolent institution. And the purpose of Street was to help the youth have stable jobs and actually have a home to live in. And Street wanted to promote its purpose and I guess also earn an alternative income stream through a for-profit business line. And he wanted to establish some hospitality businesses. So over the years, Street established 6 different hospitality businesses in Melbourne, and even went and worked with a peak body in Australia called Social Ventures Australia, which helped them strategically achieve that. Now, on the next slide, I'm going to show you how they did this. And as I said, this is a typical social enterprise in Australia. This is a typical structure. So you'll see there on the screen, in the green is Street, which is a charity. That was the existing entity, and that's a public benevolent institution which has the best tax concessions you can get in the country. He wanted to set up these hospitality businesses and needed some capital to do that. But as you know, a not-for-profit and a charity cannot get any private investors in, because a not-for-profit or a charity cannot actually issue dividends. So in order to be able to attract private investors, the way it did it was, you'll see that it established a separate company, which is the company in yellow, Street Enterprises Proprietary Limited. And it's the yellow company that actually went and purchased and operated the hospitality businesses. They did that by setting up companies and also operating a coffee roasting business. Now, Street Enterprises Proprietary Limited is a for-profit company which obviously has shares. It allocated or allotted 50% of its shares to the charity Street and the other 50% to these 5 private investors. The private investors purchase the shares and the capital goes into Street Enterprises Proprietary Limited, which then funds the business. The investors actually get their return through the dividends that they earn on those shares. Now, Street as well was a 50% shareholder in Street Enterprises Proprietary Limited, and its dividends were paid as franked dividends. And later on I'll explain about how PBIs can get refunds of franking credits, but effectively Street the charity was earning these dividends tax-free. So through this structure, which they set up, this is a social enterprise structure, they're able to get the capital that they needed. Street Enterprises ran the business. Street, the charity, found the youth. These were typically teenagers who were finding themselves to be homeless and obviously also impoverished. Street would find the teenagers who needed help and then provide them with training, employment, etc. through Street Enterprises. So these youth would actually go in and work in the cafes and work in the coffee roasting business. They would get trained, they would get paid. Street would also help fund accommodation for these young people. So Street, through the social enterprise, not only earned an income through franked dividends, and not only was able to attract these private investors, but also was able to further its purpose through the business of helping these youth find employment and accommodation. So basically a win-win for everyone involved. And I just want to read out some statistics which I think are fantastic. Street, and these statistics are now a couple of years old, but are still very encouraging. From 2017, this is where the stats are from, Street had worked with 346 young people in that year. So by 2017, they'd worked with close to 900 young people. Young people rated their sense of belonging at Street at 100%, which is amazing. I mean, to get 100% satisfaction from the young people going through the program. 92% of these young people were employed or in further training 6 months after completing their main course. And 91%, again, a high statistic, have maintained or improved their housing situation during their course. So very, very positive, encouraging statistics, all achieved through this social enterprise. So this to me is a fantastic example of what can be achieved if people think outside the square and consider other options as to how they actually promote their charitable not-for-profit purpose. So what is the problem or problems for social enterprises in Australia? What's making it so hard to establish these? I'm going to go through the main reasons. And the main reasons are, firstly, there's no proper definition of a social enterprise. Secondly, there's been a slow response to actually creating these in light of the demand for them. And thirdly, there's a lot of confusion around what structure you use. So let's go through each of these in turn. Firstly, there's no proper definition. As I told you on the very first slide, we don't have a statutory definition. There's no one definition. There are plenty of definitions floating around in Australia about what is a social enterprise. And as a result of that, pretty much anyone can call themselves a social enterprise, which only adds to the confusion, because I can tell you, because I'm talking to people in the sector every day, I've had many people come up to me, say at a conference, and I'll say, oh, Vera, we've been running a social enterprise now for 5 years. And I'll say, oh, that's fantastic. Can you explain to me what you do? And they explain it, and I have to try to politely say to them, well, actually, that's not a social enterprise. So a lot of misunderstanding and confusion generally in the community. To add to this, different countries have different meanings as to what is a social enterprise, so that makes it even harder. And finally, I want to finish here by saying, let us be certain that we understand that a social enterprise is not CSR or corporate social responsibility. My firm, Mills Oakley, is a for-profit law firm, and its primary purpose, obviously, is to provide legal services and make enough money to pay everyone's salary. It has a CSR program, so although its main purpose is to provide legal services, it does dedicate some resources to the community, and this is our opportunity as a law firm to actually do some good for the community, but that is not our primary purpose. Now, this is different from a social enterprise where the primary purpose is to actually achieve some sort of social good. So although there seems to be a little bit of a crossover, a CSR program and a social enterprise are very different, but I unfortunately find that many people confuse the two and think that if they do have a CSR program, what they're doing, in fact, is running a social enterprise, which they're not. The second problem in Australia is that although there's been a demand for social services, there's been a poor response to that. And again, why do we have that problem? Firstly, because there's insufficient learning and development. It's very hard. I mean, you're fortunate because you're listening to this webinar, but generally speaking, you can't go off to uni and do a course on social enterprise. You can't go off to the local community college and do a course on it. It's not an easy thing to learn about. So hence why we have so much confusion. Next, there aren't many statistics that are being collected. So people start showing interest, but they're really uncertain, well, should I actually go down this path because I can't read any statistics about whether it's worked or not. And thirdly, it's hard to find tailored support in terms of legal and accounting advice. So thirdly, another problem, why is it so hard to establish a social enterprise in Australia? The problem is structure. In Australia, we don't have any single legal structure which is specifically for social enterprises. We don't have a bespoke structure. What we do have is our standard for-profit structures and not-for-profit structures, and we have to somehow use those to get to the result that we want. I am going to explore that further later on in the webinar, but you'll see the different options, and to some extent it is good because you've got greater flexibility because you've got different sorts of structures you can use, but not having a bespoke structure can make it harder for people who want to set up a social enterprise. Now, this is different from overseas. So let's look at a couple of countries. In the UK, they do have a bespoke structure, and they call it a community interest group, a CIC. And in the UK, this can be either a public company limited by guarantee, or it can be a company limited by shares or a public limited company. The latter two are both for-profit companies. And what these companies do is that they issue shares to investors, but they cap the dividends. So investor going in, a shareholder knows that if I buy shares in this company, although the market would dictate, for example, that my dividend, my half-yearly dividend is $30, I know that my dividend is only going to be capped at $20 because I know that the $10 left over will be kept by the company for some social good. In the US, we have something different. We have a bespoke structure called a benefit corporation, which again is a for-profit business, but it's a business that can consider in its operations, in its bottom line, community benefits and other interests. So with a benefit corporation, the difference is that it can consider these social purposes, and it can actually, in its annual report on what these activities are. So it's actually part of the fabric of the organisation. So you'll see in other Commonwealth countries, in other Western countries, they've actually developed a bespoke model, a bespoke structure. We don't have that in Australia, which makes it a bit harder, but hopefully you'll get excited. I'm being sarcastic. You'll get excited when you see some of these structures later on, because the fact that we don't have one means that you can actually come up with some pretty interesting models. So here we go, legal structures. In this slide on the screen, I have tried to set out the main differences between a charity / not-for-profit and a social enterprise. And you'll see there's quite a bit of overlap there, but let me go through this so you can get a better understanding as to how they're different. So with a charity or not-for-profit, the origin or the initial motivation behind setting one up is that you've got some sort of not-for-profit or charitable purpose. With a social enterprise, it usually starts as a for-profit business to make money, and then it decides, oh, by the way, we want to achieve a social purpose. So they're different origins. Secondly, with a charity or not-for-profit, it must have a not-for-profit clause in its constitution. So any profits earned by a charity or not-for-profit must be retained in the organisation to be used for that purpose. With a social enterprise, you can generate a profit for the social cause, but you can also pay dividends to your investors. So there's a lot more flexibility there. With financing, charities and not-for-profits usually rely on donors or grants or some sort of membership fee. With a social enterprise, it's usually a commercial activity. It could be running a cafe. It could be selling books. It could be some other sort of business. And that's the main way that they actually get their money in. Fourthly, with a purpose for charities and not-for-profits, it's got to be a charitable purpose under the Charities Act, or it's got to be a not-for-profit purpose such as promoting some sort of industry. With social enterprises, there's no restriction. You can do anything you want. And the reason you can do anything you want is in the next line, because you pay tax. The Australian Taxation Office has this position. If you're going to be enjoying tax concessions, and they're very interested in what you're doing for obvious reasons. If you're happy to pay tax, then they're happy to leave you alone and you can do whatever you like because you'll be paying tax on it. So you'll see there are pros and cons to each, and obviously in advising clients or within your own organisation, you need to think about what is more important, the flexibility or the tax concession. So before we look at the structures that are typically used in social enterprises in Australia, we need to have a good understanding of what our traditional legal structures are for not-for-profits in Australia. And these are the 4 that are listed there. And I'm going to go through each of these quickly so you understand what they are, because you'll then see they later on feed into how we actually set up a social enterprise structure. So some of you may have heard of our first structure here, which is incorporated associations. This is a not-for-profit structure which can be used in a social enterprise. And the beauty of an incorporated association is that it is not-for-profit, it's a separate legal entity, it's eligible for tax concessions. The problem with this particular structure is you can only operate in one state or territory, you cannot pay any dividends, and you often cannot trade. The next one is a public company limited by guarantee. Again, a not-for-profit company. So the benefit of using this one in a social enterprise structure is that, again, it's a separate legal entity. It can operate anywhere in the country. It's not restricted to one state or territory. It's eligible for tax concessions, and to an extent, it can engage in commercial activities. I've listed there some key negatives. I actually don't think there are too many negatives with this structure, apart from the fact that as a not-for-profit, it cannot pay dividends. Now, a proprietary limited company. This is typically a for-profit company, and it features quite heavily in social enterprise structures in Australia. The proprietary limited company, as I said, is typically a for-profit. You can make it an not-for-profit. I wouldn't recommend that. But the benefit of this company is that it allows investors, you can have shareholders, and those shareholders can then obviously invest in the business that you want to run, and they will then receive their return through dividends. And it works quite well with social enterprise structures. The disadvantage is you can't get any tax concessions. So this is something you have to weigh up if you want to use a proprietary limited company. We've then got an Indigenous corporation, which I'll skip. It's a very rare sort of structure in Australia. There aren't too many of these. I think there are only about 2,000 of these in the country. It is useful if the social enterprise you want to establish is somehow involving the Indigenous community, so it's worth knowing about. It's similar to a company in that it's a separate legal entity and can operate anywhere in Australia. It is a not-for-profit entity. It can't pay dividends, but it is specially set up for the Indigenous community because it is somewhat customised to their traditions. Oh. Let's think about it. Now that we understand the different structures that we can use, let's start talking about tax, which is very brave of me at 6:30 of an evening. Anyway, let's start talking about tax concessions. In any social enterprise structure you want to establish, you cannot forget the tax consequences of what you're doing. If you've already got an existing not-for-profit or charity that is looking at establishing a social enterprise, generally speaking, that not-for-profit charity is enjoying some sort of tax concession. And the last thing you want to do by setting up a social enterprise is somehow risking those existing tax concessions that the charity or not-for-profit has. So a not-for-profit or charity in Australia will generally enjoy some rule of the following: income tax and CGT exemptions, DGR endorsement, FBT rebates or exemptions, GST concessions and refunds of franking credits. Before you embark on a journey of looking at establishing a social enterprise, you need to stop and identify what are your existing tax concessions that your not-for-profit charity enjoys, because you don't want to inadvertently lose any of those. So that would be one of the first steps that you need to do, because a social enterprise will generally involve some sort of for-profit business, and you want to set up in such a way where you still maximize whatever tax concessions you can get. So in this table, again, it's a summary table, I have tried to set out the different structures that I've just gone through against the tax concessions that are available. And you'll see that where the ticks are, obviously that's something that is of benefit. Where the crosses are, that could be a problem. So when you look at that table, if someone said to you, I want to establish a social enterprise that's going to operate in New South Wales and Queensland, then you wouldn't think about using an incorporated association because they can only operate in one state. Or if someone said to you, we want you to help us establish a social enterprise, but we want to do it in a way that is completely tax-free, well, then you wouldn't use a proprietary limited company because a proprietary limited company generally pays tax. So hopefully this table gives you a good start in terms of which structures are of most benefit to you in light of the 4 criteria set out at the top. You will find, and I'm going to show you some examples, you will find that generally, and Street is an example of this, generally in Australia, when you set up a social enterprise model, it's a hybrid model. By hybrid, I mean it is usually a combination of a for-profit and a not-for-profit structure. And the reason why it's usually a hybrid is that you need the for-profit in order to get the private investors in, and the not-for-profit so that you can actually fulfill your not-for-profit charitable purpose in a tax-free way. So let's look at some models. In case you don't know, this is the exciting part. So we're going to look at 3 different structures. The first structure here is your street structure. So you'll see at the top of the diagram, you have your not-for-profit or charity in the blue, and you've got your investors in the green. As we've said, a not-for-profit or charity cannot have private investors because a not-for-profit charity cannot issue shares or pay dividends. And obviously, investors usually want some return on their investment. So how do you then get investors in? That is shown in the bottom half of the diagram. What you do is you set up a for-profit proprietary limited company, and that's your street enterprises company. You have your not-for-profit as one of the shareholders. You have your investors as the other shareholders, right? So the for-profit runs the commercial business, the social enterprise, and then pays dividends to both the not-for-profit and the investors. The investors are happy because they get a return on their money. The not-for-profit is happy because it gets some income coming in. And the for-profit is actually then running the business aspect of the social enterprise. So this is a typical model, and as I said, this is your street structure. However, so let's go back. With your not-for-profit shareholder, you'll see that it is paid dividends by the for-profit. For those of you, and I guess all of you with an accounting background, you will know that charities and DGRs, deductible gift recipients, are eligible for refunds of franking credits. So in this diagram, if the not-for-profit down the bottom, the shareholders are a registered charity or a deductible gift recipient, with the dividends that it receives from the for-profit, you can actually receive refunds of franking credits on the dividends so that the not-for-profit shareholder gets the full dividend and doesn't pay any tax on it. So that's another advantage of this structure, that the not-for-profit shareholder, as I said, if it's a charity, a registered charity or DGR, gets tax-free dividends, which is obviously fantastic. I have a client, I have more than one client, but just to clarify, I have a client which, as part of its purpose, has to invest hundreds of millions of dollars because it's got perpetual obligations with regards to its operations. The refunds of franking credits on the investment of those hundreds of millions of dollars is a significant commercial benefit to that client. So refunds of franking credits can be a huge saving, and it's achieved through this sort of structure. So that's set out in that particular slide. Now, some not-for-profits will say, our board is too risk averse. We do not feel comfortable owning shares in a for-profit company. So this structure here is an alternative structure where you've still got your for-profit company set up and you've still got your investors putting in money and getting dividends back, but the not-for-profit doesn't actually own any shares in the for-profit. It actually just enters into a contract with the for-profit and either provides services to the for-profit, which it gets paid for, or the other way around. So it's a different way of a not-for-profit being involved in a social enterprise without actually owning any equity in the for-profit company. This is a third structure, which is very, very complicated, you can see, but is based on a real-life example of something we set up for a client of ours some years ago. And you'll see in this structure, although it is complicated, it's very beneficial. And although it took a while to set up, everyone was quite happy with it at the end because everyone's goals were achieved. So on the left-hand side, you've got the charity. In this example, two people came to me, two academics, and they said, we have developed some software that will help us study the mortality rates amongst humans resulting from a particular disease. And we, Vera, want to set up a charity which is going to use that software to do that medical research. But Vera, we have invested so much of our personal time and money into the establishment of this IP, this software, that we want to also be able to commercialize it. And this is a structure we came up with. So on the left-hand side, we set up the charity. It was a public company limited by guarantee. We got it registered as a charity and a health promotion charity, which is a deductible gift recipient. So fantastic tax concessions. We put the IP of the software in the charity. And the two academics were directors of that charity. That charity went off and did its medical research and enjoyed all the tax concessions. That charity then, and I'm sorry that the line is faded, but that charity then licensed that software IP to a for-profit company we set up, which is the darker blue on the right-hand side. And that for-profit company, which is a brand new company we set up, had the two academics as directors and shareholders, and also had some Singaporean investors come in who invested some of their money. So that for-profit company paid the charity a license fee to access the software. So the charity then got some income coming into that license fee. The for-profit then had a license to use that software, which it then commercialized and used for all sorts of other different non-charitable purposes. which then allowed the for-profit to earn a lot of money from those different activities, which it then paid out as dividends to all of the shareholders, including our 2 academics. So the end result was, number one, the charity was tax-free, it had the IP, it did its medical research, and the academics were involved in that. And it got income from the for-profit for licensing the software. And the other side, the for-profit had the software, which it could then commercialize and use in other arenas. It could attract these external investors, and these were from Singapore. It could make a lot of money from using that software, and our 2 academics who were shareholders got some private benefit out of that. They got the dividends from the for-profit, which was their return on their initial investment in creating the software. So a little bit complicated, but it worked for everyone, and that is a more complex example of a social enterprise. The one thing you need to be careful of here is, and I'll bring you back to the previous slide, because our academics were both the directors of the charity and also directors and shareholders of the for-profit, you need to be careful of what we call related party transactions, which are regulated by both the Corporations Act and by the ACNC. It's not that hard to make your way around that, but it is something you need to be aware of, because obviously you've got to be careful about the optics of having people benefiting at both ends of this structure, but it can be worked out, so it's not too hard. Right, let's move on to the final section where we're going to look at commercialising existing operations. This is where some not-for-profits and charities, because of all the different issues that are listed there on the screen, you know, changes in giving, government funding's reducing, it's harder to stay competitive and so on. Charities and not-for-profits are becoming more innovative, and they're looking at other ways of generating income for themselves so that they're sustainable longer term. This is actually quite topical at the moment because of COVID-19 and the fact that governments have already foreshadowed that they may be cutting down on grants going into the future. And so that's going to put pressure on charities and not-for-profits to try to make up for the money that they're losing. So some charities and not-for-profits are thinking, what can we do? What is it that we already do as a not-for-profit or charity which we can commercialise and earn some money on? This graph here is one of my favourites, which I know means I need a life, but it is a graph from 2015 from a Give Easy innovation study, which shows very, very clearly that if you look down at the horizontal axis, the innovation index, the more innovative, so this was a study done of not-for-profits in Australia, the more innovative the not-for-profit was in terms of trying something new, the more money it earned, this is the vertical axis, the more money it earned from new sources. So there's a direct correlation between being innovative, i.e. commercialising, setting up a social enterprise or anything else that's innovative, and actually earning money. And it's not only earning money from existing sources, it's earning money from new sources. So I think that's very encouraging, where overall we can see that if a not-for-profit does its homework and tries to be innovative with any of these ideas that I've mentioned this evening, it is highly, highly likely that they'll actually increase their income. But if a not-for-profit or charity is going to go down this path, one thing we need to think about is public perception. Unfortunately, in Australia, there are still many people who are conservative and who think that a not-for-profit or charity shouldn't be making too much profit, shouldn't be commercialising, they should be running on a shoestring budget. And obviously, these people don't understand that that just doesn't work. But if you are thinking of commercialising, or if you're thinking of explaining this to your clients, one of the things they're going to have to manage is stakeholder expectations as to why is my charity now suddenly out there running a cafe, for example. You're also going to have to think about the basics of law and the basics of tax before you start commercialising. You're going to need to work out for your existing not-for-profit or charity what exactly it is in a legal and tax sense. So again, you don't risk any of that. If the organisation you're working with is an existing charity, then you're going to need to make sure that if you do commercialise, or as I said before, set up a social enterprise, you don't risk your charity status. I've got there on the screen the definition of what it means to be a charity in Australia. And one of the first things you need to do is actually work out, if you are a charity, what your purpose is, because as soon as you start playing around with your purpose, there's a risk that you're going to lose your charity registration, which will have all sorts of disastrous consequences. So we need to understand our purpose, we need to understand our tax status, and that will then dictate what is commercially possible, and that'll then set out what we can actually do in terms of commercializing our activities. So all of this will help us work out how our commercial activity actually fits into our charitable purpose. If your organisation is not a charity, then it could be an income tax exempt not-for-profit. And again, I've listed all the categories there on the screen. So if your organisation is not a charity, it could be fits into one of these. If it fits into one of these categories, it's income tax exempt. And again, you have to be careful if you're going to set up a social enterprise or do some commercial activity that you don't risk your income tax exemption. Now, if your organisation is not a charity, right, and it's not an income tax exempt not-for-profit, then it is what we call a tax-paying not-for-profit, which then means you can do whatever you like because you're paying tax and the tax office is very, very happy with you. Keep in mind, however, with tax-paying not-for-profits, there's a mutuality principle, so just be conscious of that, which I won't bore you with at the moment. So your organisation has told you that they want to consider commercialising. Here on the screen are the first three questions you need to ask yourself. What are the objects or purposes of the organisation? What are the legal implications of commercialising? What are the tax concessions? And how will it affect your structure? So let's go through these one by one. Firstly, what is your purpose? I cannot emphasise this enough. If your organisation wishes to commercialise or it wishes to set up a social enterprise, the first question you need to ask yourself is, what is our existing purpose? Because your existing purpose will dictate your tax concessions and will dictate what new activities are permissible. You also need to think about, if you're going to run a commercial activity or some sort of business, where will the profits go? What are you going to be doing with the profits? To determine what your purpose is, apart from, say, if you're a charity looking up the ACNC website, you need to study your constitution. So you'll have to find that document. Look at your objects clause. That'll tell you what your objects are, what your purpose is. And you then have to also look at, to some extent, your activities. Now, general rule of thumb, if you're going to run a commercial activity and you're not doing that in order to fulfill your not-for-profit purpose, then it's highly likely you're risking a tax status. So you always have to ask yourself, why do we want to do this? Are we doing this to generate some money to pour back into our charitable not-for-profit purpose? Or are we just doing this because it is something that we're interested in? It'd be nice to have some loose money lying around. If you cannot show that the money that you're making through these activities is to pour back into your not-for-profit or charity purpose, then you're going to risk your tax concessions and it's not going to be good. As I said, your purpose is set out in your constitution. It also arises from your activities. Your activities are probably less of an indication of what your purpose is than your constitution. And here I quote the word case, which I'll just skip because we haven't got much time. Now, moving on to your tax concessions. As I said before, you need to know, before you embark on any of this, you need to know what is your purpose, you need to know what your structure is, you need to know what your current tax concessions are, because you don't want to inadvertently somehow risk those tax concessions. Now, as a result of the word case, which I just skipped, the tax office some years ago decided to set out very clearly in one of its tax rulings what commercial activities or business-like activities a charity is actually able to undertake without losing its charity status and therefore without losing its tax concessions. And there are some 5 examples here, which I'll go through in a second. You also need to know that if you've got a parent and subsidiary relationship, and I wish I had a whiteboard now to show you this, but basically, if your parent company is a charity and it sets up a subsidiary, which is a business, the business is not automatically charitable just because the parent is charitable. The tax office looks at each organisation separately. So even though your parent company may be an existing charity, If you set up a new company that's running a business, that new business is not automatically charitable just because the parent is charitable, right? So be careful with that, because as I said, the tax office will assess each one individually. So let's look at the three big questions. What commercial activities can not-for-profits undertake? How much time can you spend on it? How much money can you spend on it? And I want to add one more thing, which I'll get to in a second. Be careful, and you've all got a financial background, but obviously you'll do your homework to work out, is this commercial business actually expected to make you money or not? Because if it's not, then you'd be wondering why on earth you'd be doing it. So let's look at the first one. What activities are permissible? And these are the 5 examples that I just showed you in the tax ruling. And I'm going to go through these quickly. Now, number 1. If you generate a commercial surplus through your new commercial activities and they're used to further your charitable purposes, that is fine. The tax office says that's perfectly okay. The example they give is the Cancer Council selling sunscreen. It's not a very good example because I think selling sunscreen is in itself a way of preventing skin cancer. So one could argue that selling sunscreen actually is in itself a way of furthering the charitable purpose. But what this example really means is, and a better example would be the Cancer Council selling perfume. Selling perfume has got nothing to do with preventing cancer, as far as I'm aware. What the Cancer Council would be doing is they'd be selling perfume for the sole purpose of generating money, and the money they make from selling perfume would be poured back into the research they're doing into the prevention of cancer. So the selling of perfume is completely unrelated to the day-to-day purpose. But the tax office has said, if the only reason you're selling perfume is to make money, so you can pour that back into your main day-to-day activities, that is fine. You can remain a charity and you can remain income tax exempt and access all your other tax concessions. Example B, intrinsically charitable activities carried out in a commercial way. So a not-for-profit hospital charging patients for hospital stays is perfectly fine. There is no problem with a charity charging for the services it provides, running it in a commercial way. It can still be a charity. You've just got to make sure, obviously, that your fees are reasonable. C, commercial activities directly carried out for charitable purposes. And here you could say the Cancer Council selling sunscreen is an example of this. An organisation running a nursery is selling plants for the purposes of providing meaningful employment to people with disability. So the only reason I set up the nursery, a commercial business, is to provide meaningful employment to people with disabilities. That is a commercial business, but it's been run for the sole purpose of promoting a charitable purpose of helping people with a disability. That is perfectly fine. The tax office will allow you to remain a charity. Number 4, a commercial activity by way of an investment. The tax office has said any passive investment, such as a share portfolio or earning a building that you rent out, that is perfectly fine. You can still be a charity. And finally, number 5, if your commercial activity is incidental, that's also okay. So the example is an organisation grows vegetables to use to feed the homeless. Any surplus vegetables are then sold to the general public because they weren't used to feed the homeless. It's an incidental activity. It's not on a major scale. Again, the tax officer said that's perfectly fine. So all 5 of these are examples of commercial activities, and all 5 are clearly okay so far as the tax office is concerned. The charity will not lose its tax concessions. Number 2, how much time can you spend? I wish I could tell you. There's no black and white answer. I think, this is just me based on my experience. I think if 10 to 15% is generally okay. Once you get beyond that, you may have a little bit more explaining to do to the ACNC and the tax office. Also, the regulators are very accommodating in that if you start up a fresh commercial activity or social enterprise, and initially you have to run it more as a commercial activity to earn money in the initial years before you can then pour that into charitable activities, they understand. So I probably confused you there, but let me give you an example. We had a client which wanted to set up social accommodation and community housing for people who had nowhere to live. They wanted to be registered as a charity. They said to the ACNC, actually we said on their behalf, look, in the first few years, we're going to sell most of our units to the general public. we're only going to sell a small portion, we're only going to set aside a small portion for community housing. But the whole reason is that we'll generate enough money through those commercial sales so that over a period of 4 or 5 years, we'll be able to then put more and more units on the market for commercial housing. And the ACNC said, we understand that, it's a business plan, we're comfortable with that, and that was approved. And finally, you need to think about how much time you can spend on it, money you can spend on it. Again, it's not black and white. You'd have to sort of get proper advice about that so that you didn't risk your tax concessions. One last thing I just want to point out here. Be careful with doing your homework about whether or not this commercial activity or the social enterprise is actually going to generate you money. And I want to give you a funny example, but it's a real life one from the States, which I think brings home the message that we need to do our maths before we actually embark on this. So this was a charity in the US that was helping the homeless, feeding the homeless. They had a kitchen that wasn't being used all the time. They decided they were going to use the kitchen overnight to manufacture and sell salad dressing. So they got a grant from the government and they used their existing kitchen to start making and selling salad dressing. And they were going to sell the salad dressing for $3.50 a bottle. Sorry, they thought it cost $3.50 a bottle. They were going to sell it for $3.50, and they thought for every bottle of salad dressing they sold, they would make 35 cents a bottle in profit, and they would then use that to feed the homeless. What they forgot in doing all of their calculations was a number of things, actually. Indirect labour costs, unused ingredients that were being thrown away. They forgot about incorporating the kitchen manager's salary. They didn't put any costs for the renting of the kitchen from the charity. They didn't actually put it as a separate cost centre, effectively. And they've been generating or making these salad dressing, making the bottles of salad dressing for a while, thinking that they were making 35 cents in profit per bottle. And after a while, they actually did some proper calculations and they worked out that instead of each bottle costing them $3.15, each bottle was costing them $90 a bottle, and they were losing $86.50 a bottle. Right, huge embarrassment, and put them in all sorts of strife. So please, 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 if you're going to be thinking about starting up commercial activity or running a social enterprise, do your maths beforehand to make sure your figures are correct, that the figures are above board and transparent, so you don't end up actually losing money rather than making money. And finally, I just want to show this last diagram in terms of structure. I've given you there 3 different structures that you can consider for a commercial activity or a social enterprise. These are more examples. In option A, you can have your not-for-profit or charity enter into a contract with a business. So it's for a set term of time. It's very easy to get out of, and it's a good way of sort of putting your toe in the water to see whether or not you actually are comfortable running a commercial activity. So that's probably the least intrusive, and it'll cause the least amount of change to your existing not-for-profit or charity. The second one, option B, is we actually run it within your existing charity or not-for-profit. And as I said before, here you've got to think about, does it fit into our purpose? Is it going to risk our tax concessions and so on? How are our stakeholders going to respond to this? Because as an alternative, you can see option C, we actually set up the commercial activity as a separate entity, which is fantastic because your parent not-for-profit or charity doesn't risk its tax concessions, doesn't risk its endorsements. It doesn't have to worry about what the actual commercial activity is going to be because it'll be a separate entity. Your separate entity can be a not-for-profit or a for-profit, depending on what you prefer. And the beauty of option C is that if your commercial activity goes belly up and it doesn't work, because it's a separate entity, it hasn't affected your parent entity, right? Your parent entity will remain safe. Whereas in option B, if it doesn't work financially, it could actually affect the rest of your organisation because it's a part of your organisation. And please also keep in mind options A, B, and C, you can move from one to the other. So if you start off with B, after a period of time, you could move to C, or if you start with C, you can move back to B. So there is some flexibility there. Don't feel like you're stuck with whatever option you've chosen. So it's now about 5 to 7, and I'm running out of voice. So we're going to hand it over to question time. So I've got my lovely Ariane here, who's going to read out some of the questions that have come in over the last hour.
So we've just got one question from Paul at the moment. And if you do have any further questions, please use that meeting chat tool. Any comments on possible use of distributing cooperative structures for social enterprises?
Cooperative structures in Australia, although obviously they do exist, again, not a very common or popular structure. Again, only a couple of thousand around the country. And there's been a move in recent years to make them popular again because they do have some benefits. But because it's such an unusual structure, they generally only work in fairly limited circumstances. For some situations, for some industries, a cooperative is actually quite useful because a cooperative is generally very member focused. And so depending on what you want to do, it could be that that sort of structure is suitable. And the other thing with a cooperative is you can actually use, you have two options. You've got the non-distributing and the distributing kind. So if you wanted to actually distribute money back to members, that is a possibility. So it can work, it's just not common. I haven't seen it used very often, so I think it would only be useful in very limited circumstances.
Another question, presumably that a charity setting up a trading subsidiary has issues if it has invested significant funds and then the subsidiary fails. Would that expense be considered not a non-charitable expenditure and therefore cause significant issues for the charity?
Okay, so if the charity was basically just buying shares in the subsidiary, it was more of a passive investment, and they did their homework and it still didn't work, my off-the-cuff advice would be that it shouldn't be a problem in terms of any regulators knocking on your door and asking why you did that. If, however, the charity was heavily involved in the subsidiary, say it made a loan and the loan didn't get paid back, well, this really comes, it's a good question. It comes back to why did the charity set up the subsidiary? And I sort of spoke about that throughout the presentation. There's got to be some purpose to it. Is it like the example of Street, where you actually set up a subsidiary to fulfill your charitable purpose, or is it just for the purpose of making income through some sort of unrelated commercial activity being run by the subsidiary? So these are all things you need to think about. But let me go back to basics. And I'm talking about directors' duties. The directors of the charity of the parent company, when they make the decision to set up the subsidiary, they have directors' duties they need to think about. And they need to do their homework, and they need to the extent that it's possible, investigate how this is going to work, how likely is it to succeed, and so on. And under what we call a business judgment rule, so long as the directors can prove that it was rational to make that decision, it made sense, they had every belief to think it was going to work, but eventually it didn't, generally speaking, the board of that charity should be safe and shouldn't be made responsible for any loss suffered by the charity as a result of the subsidiary not succeeding. I'm hoping I answered the question. No other questions. Look, it's 7 o'clock, Keith. Do you want to say anything at the end?
Yes, I would just like to say thank you very much, Vera. We will be sending out the presentation tomorrow, and I'm sure if anybody wants to follow up with you, all your contact details will be in that presentation, and they can contact you after this meeting.
Thank you. I know it was a lot of material to go through, but I'm hoping people at least got a gist of what was possible.
Okay, and thank you, everybody. Good night, and join one of our next seminars. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.